In our previous videos, we went over the history and language differences between the Old and New Testaments. In this video, we will discuss a people who were considered an enemy by the Jews. They were despised and hated, and yet their name would be associated with brotherly kindness and random acts of compassion for centuries to come. As mentioned before, beginning in 537 BC, the Jewish people began to return to their lands around Jerusalem and rebuild their city and temple. Upon arriving in the land of Judea, the Jews encountered those who had not been deported to Babylon, many of whom lived in and around Samaria, who were of mixed Israelite and Gentile ancestry. When the Jews began to rebuild the temple, the Samaritans at first offered to help, but were rejected. The Samaritans would go on to antagonize the Jews, and the Jews would continually look down on the Samaritans with disdain and enmity. When the temple was completed, the Samaritans also desired to worship there, but were again refused by the Jews, who felt that the Samaritans had married foreigners and would corrupt the people. So the Samaritans decided to build their own temple on Mount Gerizim near Samaria. Centuries later, in 175 BC, the Seleucid Empire took over the land of Judea and began to persecute those that did not accept Greek traditions, philosophy, and religion. Most of the Jews refused to worship other gods and pollute the temple, and this led to the Maccabean rebellion and many wars with the Seleucids. The Samaritans, on the other hand, seem to have distanced themselves from the Jews and allowed their temple to be dedicated to the Greek god Zeus. In 110 BC, the Seleucid Empire fell, and the Maccabees, by then known as the Hasmoneans, expanded their rule from Judea to include Samaria in the north and Idumea in the south. The Hasmoneans destroyed the Samaritan temple, and only a few stones remain to this day. Of course, this only made Jews and Samaritans hate each other more, and we witness that hatred in the New Testament accounts. When Jesus met the woman at the well in John chapter 4, she said to him, "Our fathers worshipped in this mountain," meaning Mount Gerizim, where their temple had been destroyed. She continued stating that the Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. From this exchange we can see two things. First, the destruction of their beloved temple was still very much on the minds of the Samaritans. Second, the Jews felt superior to the Samaritans because they still had a temple, one that had been recently rebuilt and expanded by Herod. Jesus then assures her that soon no one would be worshiping at either temple site, but that the true believers would worship God in spirit and in truth. Jesus knew that because of the Jews' stubbornness and rebellious nature, Rome would eventually destroy Jerusalem and the temple. Later, when Jesus is asked who is our neighbor, he gave us the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan, contrasting the hypocritical nature of the Jews and the priests with the humble Samaritan who cared for a stranger in need. What can we learn from the Samaritans, the Jews, and their temples? We can see that God cares more about what is in our hearts and how we treat our neighbor than where we worship him. We can also see that Jesus praised the meek and lowly, not the proud and hard-hearted. The message of the Samaritans is that we ought to love our neighbors, including those we perceive to be our enemies or antagonizers. Who might you consider your enemy? How can you show love to them? Feel free to share any experiences with loving your neighbor in the comments below, and thank you for watching.